She only closed her eyes for a moment. But when she woke, her life was resting on a stranger's shoulder, and nothing would ever be the same. Was it fate? Or merely the quiet whisper of coincidence? The late afternoon sun poured through the glass walls of Logan Airport, turning the crowded terminal into a canvas of shifting light and restless energy. Clara Whitmore kept her stride measured, the rhythmic click of her heels cutting through the rush around her. Her leather briefcase swung with the practiced ease of a shield. At 29, founder and CEO of a thriving Boston tech firm, she carried herself with the poise of someone used to being watched. Her presence was undeniable, yet behind the flawless tailoring and designer sunglasses, a profound fatigue tugged at every muscle. A silent weight she bore completely alone. She had told her team she was flying to Seattle for a conference, but the truth was quieter, more desperate. A flight from boardroom whispers, from the sting of a lost contract, from the penthouse that had slowly become more mausoleum than home. Success, it seemed, could carve out an emptiness far deeper than failure ever could. She scrolled through emails, the screen's cool glow reflecting in her tired eyes. Deals demanded answers. Investors demanded certainty. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of her. No one saw the quiet fracture inside, the deep longing for a space where she could simply breathe. Clara had long convinced herself that love was a distraction, vulnerability a liability. Yet even she couldn't ignore the heavy press of solitude, begging her to step away from the very empire she had built so carefully. Just beyond the same gate, Daniel Hayes shifted his worn backpack from one shoulder to the other. His fingers brushed instinctively against a chipped red toy airplane tucked in the side pocket. 33. Once a promising software developer, now a single father chasing one more chan, his son, Ethan, only 6, was home in bed with a fever, watched over by their kind neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. The photo that had just buzzed onto his phone showed Ethan trying to smile over a bowl of soup, a sight that both comforted and pierced him. Every mile he traveled away from that small boy felt like leaving a piece of his own heart behind. The job interview in Seattle was supposed to be a lifeline. Steady pay, benefit, stability after years of scraping by since Claire left. But none of that made the choice easier. Guilt clung to him like a shadow, a constant companion. He told himself he was doing this for Ethan, but it didn't stop the ache of absence from settling deep within his bones. The final boarding call crackled through the loudspeakers, just as Daniel turned and hurried toward the gate. At that precise instant, Clara, her head still bent over her phone, stepped directly into his path. The collision was abrupt, a sudden jolt. Her briefcase swung open. Papers scattered across the polished floor. A lipstick rolled until it tapped softly against a chair leg. Daniel dropped immediately, gathering the scattered sheets with quick, apologetic hand. Sorry, he murmured, his eyes darting back to his buzzing phone. Clara crouched as well, a flash of irritation sharpening her features. Their fingers brushed over the same sheet of paper, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected shiver through her. She looked up, a retort forming on her lip, only to meet a pair of weary eyes that carried more weight than any apology ever could. For a heartbeat, the cacophony of the terminal seemed to soften, to recede. Then the boarding announcement rose again, pulling them both forward. Clara snapped her briefcase shut. Daniel clutched the toy airplane as though it alone could steady him. Two strangers already moving past each other, unaware that this hurried moment at gate 17 had quietly bent the course of their lives toward the same wide, indifferent ski. The line of passengers moved slowly down the narrow aisle, the soft hum of conversation blending with the low growl of engines warming for departure. Clara adjusted her blazer, her eyes scanning the seat numbers with practiced detachment. All she craved was quiet. A few hours to bury herself in spreadsheets and emails, to remind herself she was still in control of something. When she reached her row, she stopped short. The man from the gate was already there, settled by the window, his worn backpack tucked neatly beneath the seat, the small red toy airplane resting in his hand. For a fleeting second, Clara considered asking the flight attendant for another seat, but the announcement had already made it clear. The flight was full. With a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, she slid into the aisle seat. Her briefcase pressed neatly against her leg. The air between them felt thick with unspoken recognition. The awkward memory of scattered papers and brushed fingers lingering. An unexpected warmth. Clara wasted no time. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen a deliberate barrier between them. Her fingers flew across the key, each tap sharp, efficient, almost defiant. If she kept her eyes locked on work, if she buried herself in numbers and strategies, maybe she could silence the nagging awareness of the man sitting just inches away. The subtle scent of his soap and clean cotton. Daniel shifted slightly. Leaning back against the headrest, he wasn't looking at her. His gaze lingered on the small airplane in his palm, his thumb tracing the chipped paint as though the motion itself kept him tethered to something precious. To anyone else, it was just a toy. To him, it was Ethan's blessing, Ethan's unshakable belief that a piece of plastic could help keep a real plane safe. 6-year-old logic, pure and unburdened. Daniel clung to it the way other men might cling to prayer. The engines rumbled louder. The cabin lights dimmed, and the city of Boston began to slip away beneath them. Clara's eyes burned from the glow of her screen, but she forced herself to keep typing. She told herself she was fine. She was focused. She was in control. Yet out of the corner of her eye, she caught the steady rhythm of his hand on the toy plane, the small curve of a smile that came and went when he looked at it. For reasons she couldn't explain, it unsettled her. Not because it was strange, but because it was tender, a tenderness she hadn't allowed herself to feel, let alone witness, in years. Clara pressed her lips together, tightening her grip on the laptop as if she could push the thought away. Push him away. Daniel, meanwhile, felt the exhaustion of the day pulling at him. He thought of Ethan's flushed cheeks. Mrs. Alvarez's careful voice on the phone, the fragile hope that tomorrow would bring better news. He wanted to focus on the interview ahead, to rehearse his answers in his mind, but instead, he found himself listening to the quiet, determined rhythm of typing beside him. The woman next to him radiated efficiency, every movement sharp and precise. Yet when she tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, he noticed the faintest tremor in her finger, a sign that she wasn't as unshakable as she seemed, that there was something softer, more vulnerable, beneath the polished exterior. Minutes passed in a silence that was heavy, yet child. Clara fought her drowsiness with another sip of champagne. Daniel tightened his hold on the toy airplane, and the distance between them seemed both impossibly wide and far too small. Neither spoke, but both felt the strange, quiet weight of sharing the same row, the same breath of air, the same invisible thread pulling two separate worlds slowly, inevitably, closer together. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, a sound both soothing and relentlessly hypnotic. Clara kept her eyes locked on the glow of her laptop, forcing herself to read the same line of a report again and again. Numbers blurred together. The text refused to hold still. 72 hours of little more than coffee and adrenaline had finally caught up with her, and no amount of willpower could push the exhaustion back any longer. She pressed her fingertips to her temples, willing her mind to stay sharp. But the screen dimmed. Her eyelids grew heavy. Just a minute, she told herself. Just a breath. Daniel sat quietly beside her, the toy airplane resting in his palm. He could feel the pervasive weight of fatigue radiating from the woman next to him, though she fought hard to conceal it. There was something almost admirable in her determination to remain composed, but it also stirred something else in him. A quiet understanding. He knew what it was to carry too much, to act stronger than you felt. Ethan had shown him, time and again, that even the bravest needed rest. The plane shuddered gently as it slipped through a pocket of turbulence. Clara's head tipped almost imperceptibly at first, a slow surrender, until finally gravity pulled her toward him. Her blonde hair brushed his shoulder, the faint, clean scent of her shampoo mingling subtly with the traces of airport coffee on his shirt. Daniel froze, instinct urging him to shift away, to protect the fragile barrier of distance between strangers. But then he saw her face, softened by sleep, without the hard edge of focus, without the sharp lines of authority. She looked human. The dark smudges under her eyes spoke louder than her expensive suit ever could. There was something profoundly fragile about the way she had surrendered to sleep, as if even in Rare, she couldn't quite let go of the immense weight she carried. Daniel adjusted slightly, careful not to wake her, letting his shoulder become her pillow. It wasn't much, but it felt like something he could give. His thumb kept moving over the toy airplane, tracing familiar groove, a quiet rhythm, while her breath steadied against his arm. A soft, intimate cadence, for the first time all day, perhaps even longer. He felt less alone. Time slipped away. 90 minutes passed in quiet stillness. The cabin lights low, the world outside painted in streaky oranges and violets, the kind of colors that only appear at the edges of day. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window, where the horizon seemed infinite, a testament to the vastness and the fleeting nature of their journey. He thought of Ethan, curled against him on stormy night, the small comfort of knowing that his presence alone could make a child feel safe. Somehow, the same instinct carried over now. This woman didn't know her. She hadn't asked for his kindness, but she needed rest, and he could offer it. Clara stirred slowly, awareness seeping back like waves against the shore. The first thing she noticed was warmth. The second was the faint, clean scent of soap and cotton, a scent that felt surprisingly intimate. Then came the realization, sharp and mortifying, that her cheek rested against the shoulder of the man she had snapped at in the terminal. Her eyes flew open. A small, damp patch marked his shirt where she had drooled in her sleep. Horror rushed through her veins. Clara Whitmore did not fall asleep on stranger. She did not lose control, not in public, not ever. She sat upright too quickly, brushing at her jacket, fumbling for words that refused to come. An apology caught in her throat, tangled with pride and embarrassment. A silent scream of mortification. Daniel turned his head toward her, a gentle smile tugging at his tired features. He raised a hand, a quiet gesture, dismissing her panic before she could even voice it. "It's fine," he said softly, his tone carrying a calm warmth that wrapped around her shame like a comforting blanket. "Really, it's been a long time since anyone's found me comfortable enough to fall asleep on. So, thank you." His unexpected kindness unraveled something inside her. The knot she'd been carrying in her chest, wound tight with ambition and solitude, loosened just a little. Clara tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture, struggling to rebuild her professional facade. But the damage was done. He had seen her human, vulnerable, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it didn't feel as terrible as it should have. Clara kept her eyes down for a long moment, cheeks warm with the kind of embarrassment she wasn't used to feeling, the kind that made her feel exquisitely alive. But the gentle ease in Daniel's smile softened the sharp edges of her pride. Against her better judgment, she let out a quiet laugh, small but real, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in far too long. It was the laugh that opened the door, a tentative invitation. "Do you always travel with an airplane in your hand?" she asked, nodding toward the chipped red toy resting on his knee. Her voice carried a trace of teasing, but there was a genuine, disarming curiosity beneath it. Daniel turned the toy slowly, his thumb brushing the faded paint. It's not mine. It belongs to my son, Ethan. He insisted I bring it. Said it would help the real plane fly safer. His smile grew, touched with a profound tenderness. 6-year-old logic is pretty bulletproof. Something shifted inside Clara at the way he said his son's name. It wasn't casual. It was reverent. Like the word itself was a treasure he couldn't risk breaking. For a woman who had built walls against sentiment, the sound of it pierced deeper than she expected. She closed her laptop, surprising even herself, and leaned slightly toward him, drawn by an invisible thread. So, you're not on this flight for vacation. He chuckled softly. Hello, warm sound. Not even close. Job interview in Seattle. Software positions. We just moved to the city. Trying to start over? He kept his tone light, but Clara caught the shadows beneath it. The quiet effort of making life sound easier than it was. And Ethan? She asked, her voice softer now, sensing the delicate nature of his world. Does he like living in a new place? He likes dinosaurs, Daniel said, grinning, the light returning to his eye. Well, he used to. Last week he announced he's officially moved on to space. Saturn, specifically. Did you know it has 62 moons? Clara arched a brow, a genuine smile playing on her lip. I can barely manage one life. 62 moons sounds excessive. Daniel laughed. A deep, resonant sound. And for a moment, the exhaustion on his face lifted completely. It was a war. Human sound that settled between them more comfortably than the hum of the engines. Clara found herself smiling back. A genuine, unbidden response. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and the light in his expression dimmed, replaced by a sudden tension. His thumb moved quickly across the keyboard, the crease between his brows deepening. What is it? Clara asked. Her voice hushed. The unexpected concern, a prickle on her skin. He swallowed, his jaw tight. Mrs. Alvarez says Ethan's fever spiked again. She called the doctor. But his words trailed off, heavy with the fear he was trying, and failing to contain. Clara's chest tightened. She had no reason to care about this stranger's child. Yet, the thought of a sick little boy waiting for his father pulled at something in her she hadn't expected. Attender. Forgotten chord. Before she could respond, the plane jolted violently, a sharp burst of turbulence rattling the cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows as overhead bins shuddered with a sudden metallic clatter. Without thinking, Clara's hand shot across the armrest, gripping Daniel's arm, her nails pressed lightly against the soft fabric of his shirt. His first instinct was to cover her hand with his, steady and warm, a quiet anchor in the sudden chaos. It's okay, he said, his voice calm despite the worry still flickering in his eye. Just air pockets. The plane's built for much worse than this. She should have pulled away once the shaking eased, but she didn't, and he didn't move his hand either. For several long, charged breaths, they remained like that, hands joined, his warmth seeping into her, a silent conversation passing between them. Two strangers suspended above the world, tethered together by fear, by kindness, and by something neither of them had the courage or the language to name. The subtle electric current of their connection hummed in the quiet space. The quiet after the turbulence seemed to linger, their hands still joined as if neither dared to break the fragile thread that now bound them. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again, the sound sharp against the hush of the cabin. He glanced at the screen, and the color drained from his face, leaving him starkly pale. His grip on her hand tightened involuntarily before he remembered himself and let go. A fleeting loss. What is it? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper, already knowing from the desperate look in his eyes that the news wasn't good. Daniel drew a shaky breath, the tremor in his hands betraying the storm beneath his calm facade. Mrs. Alvarez called an ambulance. Ethan's fever spiked to 104. He's at the hospital now. His voice was steady, but his chest rose and fell too quickly as he typed a rushed reply, asking for details he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. How long until we land? He whispered, as if the question itself might change the answer, might bend time to his will. Clara looked at her watch, though she'd already heard the captain's earlier announcement. 2 hours, she said softly, the words feeling impossibly cruel. 2 hours might as well have been 2 lifetimes. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pressing his hands together in a futile attempt to hold himself steady. I should be there. He needs me. What if... His voice cracked, unfinished sentences piling up like wreckage in the space between them. Clara surprised herself. She didn't try to fill the silence with logic or comfort, those empty platitudes. Instead, she turned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but firm, imbued with a surprising depth of understanding. Tell me about him. Daniel blinked, thrown off balance. What? Tell me about Ethan, she said again, her eyes steady on his, an anchor in his storm. We're up here, and you can't do anything else. Tell me who he is. It took a moment, but then something inside him loosened. Words spilled out, uneven at first, then rushing like water through a broken dam. He told her about Ethan's first word. Airplane, naturally, about his obsession with dinosaurs that had recently been replaced by an all-consuming passion for the solar system, about the way he insisted on wearing his Superman cape to the grocery store, about the sound of his laugh, the way he concentrated with his tongue poking out when he drew, the stubborn brilliance that sometimes drove him to tears when he couldn't get things just right. Clara listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in years. Not for leverage, not for strategy, not to find an opening in a negotiation, just to witness love in its purest, most desperate form, spoken by a father who was terrified of losing his child. Each detail pressed against the formidable wall she had built around herself, reminding her of feelings she had long buried beneath ambition and an impenetrable facade. "He's everything good I've ever done," Daniel said finally, his voice raw. "Rolled into one small person? I can't lose him." "You won't," Clara said, though she had no right to make such a promise, to offer such certainty. Yet something in her tone carried a profound conviction, as though she had borrowed his own deep love to speak it back to him, to give it strength. When the plane touched down in Seattle, Daniel was already on his feet, backpack slung over his shoulder, urgency in every line of his body. Clara stood too, her own luggage forgotten for the moment. "I'll help you get to the hospital," she said before he could protest. "You don't have to. I want to." Her tone left no room for argument. Consider it repayment for the shoulder? For the minutes. Minutes later, she had summoned a car faster than any cab could have been found at the curb. Daniel hesitated, torn between gratitude and disbelief, the harsh lights of the pickup zone casting every worry line on his face into sharp relief. He looked at her, his eyes heavy with both exhaustion and something unspoken. A new, tentative connection. "Thank you, Clara," he said quietly, the sound of her name on his lips feeling both foreign and profoundly right. She only nodded. "Go. Ethan needs you." And then he was gone, swallowed into the stream of headlights, leaving her standing alone with her designer luggage at her feet, watching a stranger disappear into the night. Feeling strangely untethered, yet inexplicably whole, in a way she hadn't expected, the hotel room felt too quiet, too polished, too far removed from the chaos that still lingered in Clara's mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, the conference welcome packet unopened on the desk, her phone glowing in her hand. For 20 minutes, she had stared at the screen, Daniel's number saved there after their hurried exchange on the plane. Finally, she typed the words before she could second-guess herself, before her carefully constructed walls could rise again. "How is Ethan?" The reply came almost instantly. "Fever broke. He's sleeping. Doctor says he'll be fine." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her like warm water, leaving her shaken, tremulous. Then, without pausing, without another thought, she typed again. "Which hospital?" "Children's Memorial." Why? He didn't ask. Instead, she reached for her coat, her heels clicking softly against the hotel floor as she ordered another car, driven by an urgency that was completely new to her. The hospital at night was a different world. Bright lights hummed against pale wall. Footsteps echoed down sterile corridor. Voices dropped to a hush meant to protect fragile sleep. When Clara asked for room 312, the nurse's smile carried a hint of knowing, as though she'd seen this kind of quiet devotion before. Daniel was there, slumped in a chair beside the bed, both hands wrapped around his son's, much smaller one. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but he didn't seem to notice. On the bed lay Ethan, tiny, pale, but breathing steadily, blonde hair damp with sweat. The toy airplane rested on the blanket near his hand, as though guarding him through the long night. Daniel looked up when Clara entered, surprise flickering across his face, quickly replaced by profound gratitude. "You came," he whispered, his voice caught between exhaustion and a tenderness that touched her deeply. "I couldn't concentrate on quarterly projections, knowing you were here," she said lightly, setting down the bag she carried. Inside were a soft teddy bear from the gift shop, good coffee from across the street, and sandwiches she suspected Daniel hadn't thought to eat. For a moment, he said nothing, only blinked at her as if trying to understand why someone like her, a woman of such polished purpose, would choose to be here at all. Then Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were Daniel's eyes, brown, and full of life despite the fever's toll. He looked at his father, then at Clara, curiosity sparking in his gaze. "Are you Daddy's friend?" His voice was hoarse, small but steady, cutting through the sterile silence. Clara moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name, a quiet pull toward the fragile warmth of this family. "I suppose I am," she said gently, a soft smile touching her lips. "Your dad told me all about you on the airplane. He says you like dinosaurs." Ethan wrinkled his nose. "Used to. I like space now. Saturn has 62 moons." Even weak, the pride in his voice was unmistakable. Clara smiled, settling on the edge of the bed, a quiet intimacy settling between the 62. "That seems like far too many. I can barely keep up with one schedule. How does Saturn manage?" The boy giggled, a sound that seemed to lift the heaviness from Daniel's shoulders, a lightness filling the room. "They don't all have names. Some are just numbers." "That's sad, right? Everyone should have a name." "You're absolutely right," Clara agreed, genuinely surprised by the simplicity and depth of his observation. "What would you name them?" And just like that, the room filled with soft laughter as Ethan launched into an elaborate list of moon names, inspired by his favorite foods and superhero. Daniel watched silently, his expression softening in a way Clara hadn't seen before, a quiet adoration that warmed her from the inside out. For hours, they stayed like that, sharing story, telling jokes, weaving light and warmth into the sterile corners of a hospital room. Nurses passed in and out, smiling at the unlikely trio, who had somehow turned fear into a gentle, blossoming connection. Later, as the night stretched past 3 in the morning, and Ethan drifted back into peaceful sleep, Clara sat in the chair beside Daniel, her heels kicked off, her jacket draped over the back. Silence settled between them, comfortable now instead of awkward. She glanced at the boy, then back at Daniel, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I've spent so long building wall, protecting myself, making sure every move I make has a return on investment. But tonight, watching you with him, hearing the way you love him." She paused, her throat tight, A raw vulnerability exposed. It made me realize I've forgotten what love looks like when it isn't transactional, when it's just given. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the small space between them, his thumb brushing gently against her hand. A soft, deliberate touch. And in that small gesture, Clara felt something inside her shift. A profound yielding, as though a door she hadn't opened in years, perhaps had even forgotten existed, had been quietly, sensually, unlocked, allowing the first tentative light to filter through. The first light of morning crept through the thin blinds of room 312, painting everything in muted gold. Daniel stood at the small sink, splashing cold water over his face, trying to wash away the heaviness of the night. Ethan's color had returned, his breathing steady, and for the first time in days, relief loosened the knot in Daniel's chest. Still, a new weight pressed on him. The interview. It had felt impossible to leave, but Clara had insisted. "He'll be fine," she'd said, her voice calm and certain, her touch fleeting but firm on his arm. Go do this for him. So he went, clutching his worn folder of resumes, still smelling faintly of antiseptic from the hospital. The questions at the office blurred together. Skills, experience, the inevitable gaps in his resume. But Daniel answered steadily, carrying Ethan's face in his mind like a compass, a guiding light. When the hiring manager asked why he wanted the job, he told the truth. Because I need to build a life my son can depend on. And to his surprise, honesty seemed enough. By the end of the meeting, the handshake carried weight. He had the job. Back at the hospital, Daniel paused outside the door before stepping in. What he saw made his breath catch. Clara was sitting in the chair beside Ethan's bed, laptop balanced on her knees, her phone resting on the tray table. Her jacket hung neatly on the chair back, her heels tucked aside. She looked nothing like the untouchable CEO from yesterday. She looked present, human, utterly at ease. Ethan was propped up with pillows, a coloring book open on his lap, crayons scattered across the sheet. Clara glanced up from her screen every few minutes, offering comments that made the boy laugh. She had just leaned over to suggest that one of Saturn's unnamed moons should be called Pancake. And Ethan giggled so hard, his cheeks flushed pink again. The sound filled the room. Bright and alive, Daniel lingered at the threshold, watching for a moment longer, soaking in the unexpected scene, before stepping inside. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. The smile she gave him wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was simple, genuine, and for him alone, a quiet acknowledgement of shared trust. Well, she asked, her voice soft. Expectant. I got it, he said, still half in disbelief, the words feeling almost sacred. I start in 2 weeks. That's wonderful, she replied, her smile widening, lighting her whole face. A radiance that stole his breath. Ethan clapped his hand, dropping a crayon onto the bedspread. See, Daddy, I told you the plane would help. He held up the toy airplane proudly, as though it had single-handedly landed the job. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, taking the toy gently from his son's hand. His gaze flicked to Clara, soft with gratitude. A silent promise. Looks like this little thing has more power than I thought. Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. A playful, knowing spark in her eye. Maybe you should let it guide you then, at least until you figure out the rest. There was a pause, filled with a quiet hum of monitor and the palpable warmth of shared understanding. Daniel nodded slowly, still holding the toy between them. A silent pact. All right, we'll let the plane lead. Clara tilted her head, her voice gentler now. A subtle invitation in her tone. And maybe we start with something simple. Friendship. No pressure. Just seeing where it goes. Daniel exhaled, a soft sound, as though he had been holding his breath since the moment they met. Friends, he agreed, his tone carrying more than the word itself. A silent acknowledgement of the deeper currents flowing beneath. Ethan looked from one to the other, his small smile widening. Then we're a team, he said firmly, as if sealing the agreement with the undeniable logic of childhood. And in that quiet hospital room, under the pale wash of morning light, 3 lives that had once been separate began to bend toward each other, drawn together not by grand gestures or polished plans, but by laughter, by kindness, and by a chipped red airplane that suddenly seemed like the truest compass of all. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm none of them had expected. A dance between 2 cities. Clara flew back to Boston, her calendar packed with board meetings and investor calls. Yet her phone became the quiet anchor she carried everywhere. Between agenda items, in late-night strategy session, she found herself waiting for a familiar ringtone, one that now mattered more than any quarterly projection. Their first video call had been simple. Ethan, propped up against a pillow, held the toy airplane high so Clara could see. It worked, he declared proudly. Daddy got the job because of this. Clara laughed, her voice softer than she remembered it could be. A sound of pure delight. She told him she believed him. And in that moment, the distance between Boston and Seattle seemed to shrink, becoming less a barrier and more a bridge. From then on, the calls became part of their days. A cherished ritual. Ethan insisted on showing her his drawing, his new favorite book, the messy attempts at building cardboard rockets in the living room. Sometimes Clara would be in a glass-walled conference room, the city skyline, a glittering backdrop, and Ethan would hold up a crayon-scribbled Saturn with all 62 moons labeled, though half were named after his favorite foods. Daniel would sit in the background, smiling quietly, the pride in his eyes impossible to miss, his gaze lingering on Clara, a silent appreciation for her presence in their lives. It didn't take long before phone calls turned into flights. Clara began booking weekend trips to Seattle under the guise of regional meetings. Daniel teased her about the transparent excuses, but she only smiled, never correcting him. Each visit carried his own small rituals. Coffee runs from the shop across the street from the hospital, Walks through the park, where Ethan ran ahead with his cape flapping behind him. Quiet dinners in Daniel's modest apartment, where laughter seemed to come easier than it ever had in Boston's sleek, impersonal restaurants. The air between them, in the close confines of his home, often thickened with an unspoken intimacy, a subtle current of attraction that neither rushed to define, but both implicitly understood. Back in Boston, Clara found herself staring out of office windows longer than usual. For years, she had run her company like a fortress, every decision sharp, every hour accounted for. But now she was rearranging her calendar, creating remote work policies under the banner of modern flexibility. Her board applauded the innovation, never suspecting that the real reason was simpler. She wanted time. Time to be in Seattle. Time to sit on the floor with Ethan and help him tape cardboard wings to a shoebox. Time to hear Daniel's laugh in person, instead of through a phone speaker, to feel the warmth of his presence. Half her life remained in Boston, polished and relentlessly ambitious, but the other half began to take root in Seattle. She learned the best flight times to avoid delays. She grew familiar with the airport gates, the rhythmic cadences of boarding call, the small thrill, a quiet flutter in her chest, of seeing Daniel waiting near baggage claim, Ethan waving both arms like a flag. The distance was still there, measured in miles and hours, but it no longer felt like a wall. It was simply the space between 2 points that were slowly, deliberately drawing closer together, pulled by an invisible, yet undeniable gravity. And somewhere between those flights, between the boardrooms and bedtime stories, Clara realized she was no longer just visiting. She was building a life that stretched across 2 cities, a life that held laughter and cardboard rockets, and the gentle certainty of a man who had once been a stranger at gate 17. What had started as chance was now choice. A choice she made again and again, every time she stepped onto a plane, bound for Seattle. 1 year slipped by almost without notice, woven together by video calls that became flights, and flights that became a rhythm as steady as breathing. By then, Seattle no longer felt like a place Clara merely visited. It had become another home, though she rarely admitted it aloud. Her company's new Midwest office was thriving, and tonight, she was hosting her first gala in the city that had quietly changed her life. The ballroom glimmered with glass and light, filled with polish and laughter, and the hum of conversations about innovation and growth. Clara stood at the podium, her notes spread neatly in front of her, her speech rehearsed down to the cadence of each pause. Yet as she looked out across the crowd, her eyes snagged on something near the door. Daniel, in a black tuxedo that fit him so well, it stole her breath for a moment. And beside him, Ethan, dressed in a tiny suit with a clip-on bow tie, carrying something carefully behind his back. Clara faltered, her words catching in her throat, a soft, involuntary gasp. The audience shifted, murmuring at the pause, but she barely heard them. Her gaze was locked on the 2 figures making their way through the crowd, a sight that warmed her from the inside out. Ethan reached her first, climbing the steps with determination, and thrust a painted canvas into her hand. "I made it for you," he said proudly, his small voice carrying through the microphone she hadn't realized was still low enough for him to reach. On the canvas, 3 figures stood hand in hand beneath a starry sky. Above them, a plain sword, and Saturn glowed in the corner with all 62 moons scattered like jewels. "That's us. We're a family now, right?" The room held its breath. A collective pause in anticipation. Clara knelt down in her elegant gown, pulling Ethan into her arms, the scent of his childhood skin a comfort. Her voice trembled, thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. We're a family." When she looked up, Daniel was there, stepping onto the stage, his expression both nervous and utterly certain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Then, with a quiet strength that melted her, he knelt before her, in front of 300 of Seattle's business elite. He spoke into the microphone Ethan had just abandoned. "That flight a year ago was supposed to last 4 hours," he said, his voice steady, rich with a profound meaning that resonated deep within her. "But Clara, it became the beginning of everything. I want to keep flying with you, through turbulence and clear skies, through whatever life throws at us. Will you marry us?" Ethan and me, the boy, unable to contain himself, bounced on his toe. "Say yes. I already told everyone at school you would." Laughter rippled through the room, softening the hush of anticipation, making the moment exquisitely human. Tears blurred Clara's vision, smudging the edges of her carefully applied makeup. Nothing about her life had gone according to the meticulously crafted plan she once clung to, and for the first time, she was profoundly grateful for it. Her voice broke, but the words rang clear, filled with an overflowing joy. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Applause erupted, cameras flashed, but in the luminous bubble of that stage, it was only the 3 of them, perfectly, intimately bound. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, its cool weight a sweet promise. Ethan wrapped his arms around both their legs, squeezing tight, and the crowd melted into a blur of sound and light. Background to their shared moment, months later, beneath a sky streaked with gold and lavender, they stood beside Lake Washington, vows spoken in the presence of close friends and a handful of family. Clara wore a gown that shimmered like water, simple yet elegant. Daniel's hand was steady in hers, his touch a comforting warmth. Ethan marched proudly down the aisle as the ring bearer, complete with soft, bare ears Clara had ordered just for him. "Mrs. Alvarez cried through the entire ceremony. As they exchanged ring, Daniel whispered, his voice for her alone, "That 4-hour flight gave me forever?" And Clara, with tears on her cheeks and laughter in her voice, knew it was utterly, profoundly true. The chipped red airplane rested on the table of gifts that day. No longer just a toy, but the compass that had led them here, to a family neither of them had planned for. But both had needed more than they'd ever known. 3 years slipped by like pages turned too quickly. Yet every one of them carried its own weight of memory, its own gentle imprint. Clara and Daniel's life together was far from a storybook fantasy. But it was real, full of laughter, stubborn arguments that always ended in tenderness, Sunday mornings tangled in blankets with the scent of coffee and skin, and a dog named Saturn, who somehow always managed to chew the wrong pair of shoes. Ethan had grown taller, old gangly limbs and boundless energy, yet the chipped red airplane still sat on his nightstand. A quiet reminder of the day everything began, a silent guardian of their journey. On a quiet evening in their Seattle home, the house finally settled after a long day. Saturn dozed in the corner, his paws twitching in dream. Ethan lay asleep in his bed, the soft rise and fall of his chest illuminated by the small, gentle glow of a nightlight shaped like Saturn itself. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms folded, her gaze lingering on the boy who had once been pale and fragile in a hospital bed, now whispering big dreams even in sleep. Daniel came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders, his touch warm and familiar, his voice low. "He's getting so big. 9 already." Clara leaned into him, a soft smile tugging at her lip. "Still can't pronounce Saturn, right? Still calls it Saturn." Daniel chuckled quietly, his eyes fixed on their son. "I don't ever want him to outgrow that." For a moment, silence stretched, filled only by the quiet hum of the house, the beat of their two hearts. Then Clara turned, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a soft, intimate pressure. She hesitated, as though savoring the immense weight of what she was about to say, the new secret blossoming between them. "I went to the doctor this morning." Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with a fragile wonder. "Daniel, I'm pregnant." He froze, blinking at her, the words settling into his chest like dawn breaking over water. An overwhelming, beautiful wave, then joy spread across his face, wide and unrestrained, and he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, before remembering to lower his voice so as not to wake Ethan. He spun her once, careful and laughing softly. "A private, intimate dance. You're serious?" She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her hand already moving to her still flat stomach, a gesture of profound tenderness. 7 months from now, Ethan's going to be a big brother. Daniel pressed his forehead to hers, overcome with emotion. The scent of her hair, her skin, filling his senses. "Another adventure?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The best kind," she answered, her hand still resting on her stomach, a silent promise to the new life with it. They stood there in the doorway together, watching their son sleep, his toy airplane clutched loosely in one hand. Even in dream, that small piece of plastic had once been nothing more than a child's charm. But now it felt like a compass, the silent witness to every step that had followed. A chance meeting, a shoulder offered, a choice to stay, when either could have walked away. Outside the window, a plane crossed the night sky, its lights blinking softly against the darkness. Clara followed its arc with her eyes, remembering the profound weight of exhaustion that had pulled her into Daniel's shoulder at 30,000 feet. What had been nothing more than an accident had turned into the flight of her life. She tightened her grip on Daniel's hand, her voice steady, filled with wonder and a deep, sensual contentment. It all started up there. He kissed her temple, his gaze never leaving Ethan. And it's still going, still flying, in that quiet house, with a sleeping boy, a dreaming dog, and the precious secret of new life growing between them. Clara and Daniel knew that some journeys aren't measured in hours or miles. Some journeys last forever, carrying you past every storm, every stretch of clear sky, until family itself becomes a destination. And as the night deepened, they held each other close, certain of one thing, that their flight was still in motion, and always would be.